It's a privilege to have Professor Imre Galambos from the University of Cambridge today here among us, presenting his research on Chinese texts among the Uighurs. Imre Galambos specializes in the study of medieval Chinese manuscripts from sites in northwestern China. He received his PhD in 2002 from the University of California, Berkeley, with a dissertation on the structure of Chinese characters in the pre-Qin period. For the following 10 years, he worked for the International Dunhuang project at the British Library, as a result of which his research gradually shifted to medieval manuscripts from Dunhuang. Since 2012, he has been teaching at the University of Cambridge, where he is now reader in Chinese studies. Among his main interests in the dynamics of the spread of the texts and manuscripts along the multilingual networks known today as the Silk Roads. His books include Orthography of Early Chinese Writing, 2006, Manuscripts and Travelers, 2012, Translating Chinese Tradition and Teaching Tangut Culture, 2015, and Dunhuang Manuscript Culture, End of the First Millennium, 2020. Thank you. Please, Professor Galambos, give your lecture.
Thank you, Martin, for the wonderful introduction. It's a privilege to be here, and I realize that I'm not a Turkologist, but nevertheless, I think we work on material that is closely related. So it's good that we're talking. So I'll share my screen now. So I'll be talking about Chinese texts among the Uighurs, and as you probably all know, if we look at the modern map of China, these sites, these medieval sites that yield large numbers of manuscripts, actually are all located in northern and northwestern China. So here I marked a few of them. Maybe the most prominent is Dunhuang, and then slightly to the north and to the east of it is Karakoto. And then towards what is today Xinjiang, we have Kochou and Kucha and Khotan and maybe Kashgar, these places. So these are the places where Chinese manuscripts survive from this period. Interestingly, they do not really survive in large numbers from central China. So we have a situation where the peripheries are quite important for preserving a kind of culture and textual heritage that is usually associated with the center. But nevertheless, most of what we have is from the periphery. And the other important place where Chinese manuscripts come from is actually Japan, which is not shown here on the map, but it's also outside central China. And I think it's quite interesting that this is the case. People always claim that it's because of the desert climate of Xinjiang and the Gobi Desert in Gansu that all of these things are preserved in Western China, but that might not necessarily be the case, because in Japan, you don't have a desert climate, and nevertheless, you have thousands of Buddhist manuscripts preserved, some of them produced in Japan in Chinese, but also many of them taken there from China. And actually, if we look at the region where the Song Empire was, we can see that compared to modern China, it was actually quite small. And all of these sites where our manuscripts come from, they were outside of the Song Center. And if we look on the map of Eurasia, we can see that the spread of the Song Empire was actually relatively small, relatively modest. And this is the region at this point, so that the second half of the 10th century and then the 11th century, which we might call China today. And of course, the word China is very problematic at this period, because these other parts that are today part of China were not part of states where Chinese was the predominant language. So where they were other states here. And partly for this reason, I'd like to advocate this concept of Sinitic texts or Sinitic written culture rather than just plain Chinese written culture. And I think it's important to realize that actually this Sinitic written culture was shared throughout East Asia and parts of Central Asia. So if we look at the territory where Chinese texts were in use, we can see that it was much larger than the actual Chinese state, the Song state, because this region spread out towards the south and also towards the east, encompassing Japan and Korea, and what is today in the north, what is today Mongolia, and large parts of Central Asia. So these are the regions where Chinese texts were being used, and they were not always used by Chinese people, so people who grew up speaking the language that is approximate to what we call Chinese today. And I think this is a very important kind of concept to see it this way, that in a way, people have complained, scholars have compared the use of Sinitic text and language to that of Latin culture in Europe. So there were many countries in Europe, and nevertheless, there was this shared Latin-based culture, not only in countries where the language evolved from Latin, so in like France and Spain and Italy, but also in other cultures, all the way to the British Isles and parts of Middle and Central Europe. So we have something similar happening in East and Central Asia as well with regards to Chinese writing and Chinese texts. But if you look at the sites from which we have Chinese texts, you can see it's actually even larger. So Chinese texts or Chinese writing have been discovered all the way to Hungary, actually. So you have Chinese bronze mirrors. Then in Turkmenistan, you have an actual Chinese Buddhist text discovered and some administrative texts. And in sites from the Russian steppe, you also have Chinese objects with Chinese characters and so forth. So you can see that this is a kind of writing system and written culture that goes well beyond what we might consider very legitimately as Chinese. So this was a shared culture that goes well beyond China. And if we look specifically at Uighurs, I would like to point out a few ways in which they would be engaging with Chinese texts. And the most obvious of these is, of course, reading the text in Chinese. So this sounds simple, but it might not be as simple because there might be different ways of doing this. One of them, the most simple one, would be bringing a text from the East, so from Chinese-speaking parts of East Asia, and then reading it using the Chinese pronunciation. But of course, you can produce such a text. You can make a copy of that text somewhere in Kochou, and then this would be a slightly different situation. But nevertheless, in each case, you're reading a Chinese manuscript using the Chinese pronunciation. And probably this pronunciation would be different from the pronunciation in Central China. And then we have evidence from transmitted Chinese historical texts about the Uyghurs reading Chinese texts in Uyghur, similar to how the Japanese would read Chinese text in Japanese. So with regards to Japan, there have been arguments saying that this kind of text that is read in Japanese, even though it looks Chinese, it is in fact in Japanese, or you could say it is both in Chinese and in Japanese. And I think a similar situation was happening also among the Uighurs. At least there are records of this in Chinese historical sources. And then another way of engaging with the text is adding a translation or pronunciation to the text, probably beside the Chinese characters. So the translation would be, in a sense, a gloss, a semantic gloss, and a pronunciation would be a sound gloss. And this was an easy way of working with the Chinese text. Oh, actually, I meant a different thing. So the first one would be adding the actual translation, writing the translation in the text, and sometimes between the lines, but also sometimes as part of the text. And we'll come back to this and look at some concrete examples. And number 4 would be adding phonetic or semantic glosses to the side. So basically, you have a text that is in Chinese and was probably written without thinking of this later process of adding these glosses to it. And then at the later point, somebody adds on the side the pronunciation and the meaning, or the meaning of characters. And then there's a relatively common and nevertheless really, really interesting way is transcribing the Chinese text phonetically using the Uyghur script. So there are quite a few examples of this, and I think they're always very, very interesting because they give evidence that the Chinese texts were not necessarily, the Chinese language, writing a Chinese text was not necessarily always written with Chinese characters. So it could be just as easily written in another alphabet or script as, for example, the Uyghur script. But this was not always just the Uyghur script. There were other scripts writing Chinese, say the Tibetan script, or sometimes they would use Brahmi to write it. So there are not too many examples of this, but there are quite a few showing that this was not an isolated phenomenon. And I think they're really interesting, especially for reconstructing Middle Chinese pronunciation, because in this case, rather than just having these logographs of the Chinese script, you also have a very clear phonetic transcription. And then finally, I should mention that reusing Chinese manuscripts to write Uyghur text was also a quite common and relatively well-attested practice. And I'm sure most of you know about this practice or have even studied this. And we should, right at the beginning, talk about this phenomenon of engaging with Chinese texts from the point of view of East and Central Asia. We need to note that this was not just the kind of a phenomenon limited to the Uyghurs, but it was practiced pretty much all over Central Asia and East Asia. So most notably, you have lots of examples of this with Tibetan. So in this case, you see a Tibetan translation of a Chinese primer. So this is an educational text intended for children. The text is called the Family Instructions of the Grand Duke. So the Taikong Jiajiao in Chinese. And this text has been recognized relatively recently, because originally people thought these were Confucian maxims and they could not identify the source text. But now it's quite clear that this is not one of those treatises, not something of scholarly value or significance, but this is something children would have learned, children would have used to study, to write, and also to study the content of the classics, because the text consists of quotes from different Chinese texts. the Chinese classical text mostly. And to have a Tibetan translation of this shows that there was an interest among Tibetan-speaking population to have access to a text that was used by Chinese children to learn Chinese, to learn to read and write Chinese. It's a fascinating example. And here's a very famous example of the Tangut translation of the classic of filial piety. And it's in the cursive script, the Tangut cursive script. So it was very difficult to read for a long time until scholars did not get to that level where they were more comfortable with reading Tangut cursive script. The important thing is that this work, the classic of filial piety, was among the first things translated into Tangut. But not only into Tangut, but into some other language as well, including Jurchen. We know this from historical sources. Again, even though we don't have surviving manuscripts of that. But for Tangut, we do have a surviving example, and I think there is also a printed edition of this, a printed version of this text as well. And quite interestingly, in Chinese, this is a very, very central text to Chinese culture. And quite interestingly, this Tangut translation preserves a version with a commentary that did not survive in Chinese. So the Tangut text can be used to reconstruct the Chinese commentary that was already lost. It's a known commentary, people know about it, but we don't have an example of it in Chinese. And here, yet another really famous example is the Tangut Chinese so-called Timely Pearl in the Hand, which is a dictionary, or rather a phrase book. And you can see that in the middle you have Chinese phrases, or it's Chinese compound words, and then you have Tangut translations of that. So this is a bilingual phrase book that was used in the Tangut state. And there are quite a few different versions of it. There are different copies of it. And this is a printed edition, as you can see. And finally, also wanted to mention this, the simple way of kind of annotating Chinese text, in this case, again, using Tibetan, the Tibetan alphabet. So we have the text of the Lotus Sutra, the 25th chapter, which is this, also known in Chinese as the Guanyin Jing, so the Sutra of Avalokiteshvara, one of the most popular scriptures in Dunhuang, and probably the entire medieval East Asia. And this is a booklet, and on the first page you have Tibetan phonetic glosses next to the Chinese characters. And quite interestingly, the Tibetan glosses are aligned, they're in the same orientation as the Chinese characters. So you cannot read the Tibetan continuously because Tibetan reads horizontally, of course. But what you do is you read it syllable by syllable, or in some cases you have two syllables, but basically character by character as the Chinese text appears on the page. And just to cite another example, which is done in a different way, this is a Tibetan annotated copy of the Qianzuwen, so the 1,000-character text. And in this case, the Tibetan sound glosses are written at 90 degrees. So you have to turn the paper sideways. But once you do that, you can read the text continuously because Tibetan reads horizontally that way. So, but that also means that you would not be reading the Chinese characters at the same time, because for that, you would need to turn the paper back. And these are two different ways, two completely different ways of kind of annotating a Chinese page filled with writing. And I think the purpose in both cases is different. So in this second case where you can read the Tibetan continuously, this would be, I assume you would be reading the Tibetan text continuously. So you would be chanting this text rather than engaging with every single character. So you would not be looking at the Chinese necessarily, but you would be reading it continuously. And with in the previous example, it's quite the opposite. Your focus would be on the Chinese characters, and the phonetic glosses are probably simply there to help you read them. And again, since you work on Old Uyghur, or at least Uyghur, or some of you work on it, I think you must be familiar with these fragments. So there are Old Uyghur fragments of the Tianziwen, so the 1,000-character classic. It's the same text that you see here annotated in Tibetan, in the Tibetan script. And you have quite a few copies by now surviving in or identified in Uyghur. And as you can see, you have, in some cases, you have Chinese characters added to the Uyghur text. And here are some more examples, which are maybe more visible. And as you can see, you would have, in some cases, only the first character of every 4-character phrase of the Chinese text. And then you have these horizontal lines indicating that there would be 3 more characters. But it was unnecessary to write these other 3 characters because once you knew where you were in the text, then you could just simply, you would know which characters came there. And the Uyghur text can transcribe the sound of these characters and also translate them. And in this way, it's actually quite similar to this Japanese way of reading Chinese texts. And this was called the Monzen Yomi, which is basically the way of reading this literary anthology called Wenxuan. So this Monzen Yomi way is when you read, here you have the first 2 lines of the 1,000-character classic or 1,000-character text, and you read the first 2 characters as using the Chinese pronunciation, so tenchi, and then you translate it into Japanese. So tenchi no ametsuchi wa, and then you move on to the next 2 characters and you read it using the Chinese translation, the Chinese sound as genko, and then you read the you put the translation there, to kuroku kinari, and this means heaven and earth was dark and yellow. And then you move on to the next line, just where you do the same thing. So basically, each 2 characters you read first with the Chinese pronunciation, and then you translate it into Japanese. So this kind of reading is very similar, I think, to how in some cases, not in all cases, but the same text, the Tianziwen, was read by the Uighurs. And I also wanted to mention that there's a similar system called Nisaya system in Southeast Asia, where Pali words and phrases were directly followed by a translation into the vernacular. Say in Laos, there would be the Pali, which was the language of religion, and then you would have a translation into Lao. And again, this is a very similar system, even though this kind of system is probably unrelated. So it was invented or it was practiced independently in Central Asia and also in Southeast Asia. That partly for that reason they have different names. And this kind of system actually continued in China, in central China as well. So here we have an example of the same classic. Well, we haven't talked about it yet. The classic of filial piety. And here you have the original text, and the original text is followed by a translation. So I don't know if you can read Chinese, but here it says 子曰, and then it's translated into vernacular Chinese, 孔子说. Basically, you provide the original text, and even though what comes after it looks like annotation, it's not really annotation, but it's a translation into the vernacular language. And quite interestingly, this printed edition was done by a Uyghur person. So this Savinj Kaya in 1308. So this, he was basically adapting this Uyghur technology of reading Chinese text to reading Chinese texts in modern Chinese, in spoken Chinese, which is, again, a fascinating thing. And I think this kind of translation is indebted to the way the Uyghurs were engaging with Chinese texts. And the same thing or very similar thing happens with, for example, the early Mongolian translation of the same book, of the Classic of Filial Piety, where you have the Chinese text, the Chinese original, which is then followed by a translation into Mongolian. And here we have an example. So you see, for example, this here's like this, 曾子辟喜曰, and so the 曾子 is translated. So this section is translated afterwards. It's put after the Chinese text. So this way, the text itself becomes a bilingual text, but it's done in a way that the original Chinese characters and the Chinese text remains important. It remains part of the edition. And rather than just having the translation only, it's important to have the original text, partly because it's a classic, it's respected. So in this case, it's a Confucian classic, but in many other cases, you would have a Buddhist text. And so that's a sutra or another important text. And again, I should not be the person introducing this volume to you. I'm sure many of you know it. So this volume produced by Professor Shogaito and Professor Abdurrashid Yaqub and Setsu Fujishiro is based on a manuscript text, U5335, which contains Chinese texts written in Uyghur script. So they are transcribed phonetically. And there are quite a number of texts that have been identified already, and there are some of them that have not been identified. And quite interestingly, this booklet, I think, contains about 35 pages and is now kept in Berlin. And for us working on Chinese texts, it's really, really interesting, partly because of the pronunciation of Chinese characters, because this pronunciation was probably based on a local pronunciation or maybe the Dunhuang pronunciation. And in some cases, this is there are some surprises. For example, the word nian, the N initial is transcribed with a T, for example, and this happens consistently. So this is not something that you would learn from Chinese texts. This is not necessarily obvious. And in some cases, you have discrepancy between the Chinese text. And of course, this Chinese text is not in the original manuscript. This is partly reconstructed or maybe matched against an existing text, which is why it's quite interesting that we have perhaps a different version of the Chinese text, but then we need to match it against something that we know. And here's the manuscript, and as you can see, this is in a booklet format, so in a codex form. It's a sewn booklet, and quite interestingly, the backside, the verso of the paper contains the Chinese Buddhist scripture. So this is part of the Avatamsaka Sutra. And what's striking for me, for example, is that just by looking at the script here, the Chinese script here, we can tell that this is an early copy of the Avatamsaka Sutra because of the way the characters are written. So paleographically, it's obvious that this is a text that was written sometime in the 5th century. And there's quite a bit of discrepancy then in time with the Uyghur text, which would have been several centuries later. And I think that's fascinating. And this kind of way of writing Chinese is something quite specific to this early period. So let's say the 5th century, sometimes even earlier. And if you know, from about 500 onward, in Buddhist text, the length of line became 17 characters in China. And so this scripture or this copy was written before that. So you don't have 17 characters per line. You have probably about 19 characters per line, occasionally 20. So this is an early manuscript. And rather than just thinking about okay, it's early, that doesn't tell us much, but actually does tell us much, because it shows that when this originally Chinese manuscript was used to create the Uyghur text, used to create this booklet and then write the Uyghur text, this manuscript would have been already, say, about 500 years old. And that entails some sort of additional consideration. I don't believe that this text, this manuscript would have been recycled solely for the purpose of reusing the paper. But I think it was important that the Avatamsaka Sutra was on the inside. So this becomes the inside where it's not seen anymore, because the verso of the Chinese text, which was blank, now becomes the outside and produces the pages onto which the Uyghur texts were written. And what's another thing that's interesting here, actually, is that the original Chinese sutra was a scroll, but it is used here to produce a booklet. So there's a change in a book form, and it's not uncommon, but it's nevertheless quite interesting. And this book form is something that was already used in Dunhuang in the 10th century. So it's possible that this book form comes from there, along with Chinese Buddhist texts. But the fact that the Uyghurs in the Turfan region, they had access to Chinese manuscripts that were already 500 years old, I think it's very, very interesting, and it's quite important. And my own reason or my own justification why they would do such a thing, why they would reuse a manuscript, is that I actually think that it mattered what was on the inside. So this original Chinese manuscript continued to have religious efficacy and to kind of maybe amplify the efficacy of the final booklet. Okay, and this is a manuscript that was published by Professor Zime. He was talking about this is a text now cataloged as star U9006. So this is a copy of a Uyghur manuscript, but the original manuscript, if I understand correctly, is now completely gone. So we don't have it, and we only have this transcription. And I was really interested in this article of his because, again, this was a transcription of a Chinese text. And the Chinese text is this one. So this is in Chinese, it's called the Chanmen Shi, so the 12 hours of Chan. And this is a text. What you see here is a copy published by the famous Chinese scholar Luo Zhenyu. And quite interestingly, this is the earliest version of this text ever published. So this came out, I think, in very, very soon, something within like 2-3 years of the discovery of the Dunhuang library cave. So it's an early publication. And quite interestingly, this manuscript, which was used to produce this text, the manuscript was also lost. So we don't have that. So we don't have the Uyghur manuscript on the basis of which we have the Uyghur transcription, and we don't have the Chinese manuscript either. But there are other copies of the Chinese manuscript, of the Chinese text in different manuscripts. So here's a copy, for example, dated to 970, so the late 10th century. And essentially, this is the same text. And there are some other copies as well. And altogether, I managed to collect 6 different Chinese editions. All of them are from Dunhuang, except for the last one, which is a Turfan copy. And I think if you compare them side by side, it's quite interesting that not only the Uyghur text, but also the Chinese texts have variation as well. And sometimes you can use the Uyghur text to maybe decide between the Chinese versions, which one is the best reading, but rather which one would have been the one used for the Uyghur transcript, for the Uyghur transcription. So here, for example, you see that all of them, all of the Chinese versions have the character xin at the end of this line, except for one which has the character shen. And we know that both of them would have been pronounced quite similar, something like shin, except that the heart, the xin, ends with an M, and shen ends with an N. So the Uyghur would match the xin, the heart part. Or in other cases, like here, so we have variations such as guanshen fei changjiu, or guanshen zhi bu jiu. So the Uyghur text makes it quite clear that it cannot match the ones on the top, but rather probably this C5, which is zhi bu jiu. So zhi bu jiu is much, much closer than any of the other ones, which just simply cannot function with this transcription. And this is a text, as you can see in the translation, this is a text that kind of divides the day into 12 hours and then talks about what somebody who's practicing Chan Buddhism would have to do, or what are the things he would pay attention to. So at sunset, in the hour of the rooster, see the impermanence of your body, that thought after thought is not separate from mind. Always keep the rosary in your hand. And basically that's the meaning, that's the text assigned to one specific hour. And so that's the hour of the rooster. To show you another line of is this one. And so this is the hour of the boar, or the hour of the pig. And here we can see something that's quite interesting, is that sometimes you have, for example, here you have 4 syllables, and this Y syllable, as Professor Zima has also noted, is probably a typo or it's a mistake. And we don't know if it's a mistake in the transcription, which is the only thing extant, or this was already in the manuscript. But then you have something like this second line, which is problematic for most of the versions, except probably for the C4, whereas 金屋早语改. And in this case, the Uyghur transcription actually matches the Chinese one, even though the Chinese seems to be an inferior reading in terms of the meaning. But it's also possible that other characters would have been used rather than these characters. And I think this is fascinating, how we can use a Uyghur transcription of a Chinese text to kind of align it side by side with Chinese versions, and then see if there's if it can be helpful to find which version is the preferable one, or at least maybe track the transmission of this text into Uyghur. We can see which are the versions that could have been used for the Uyghur transcription. And again, you probably all know this volume by Johan Elverskog. I found it very, very useful when looking at these texts, because I noticed how often the Uyghur texts are based on Chinese texts, how often you see these Buddhist texts translated from Chinese. And this book also has a specific section on Chinese Apocrypha, so texts that were produced in China, but which were not translated from Indic languages. And this is a special category of texts, of course, because there's only one possible route of transmission, and that is from China. Whereas if you're dealing with, say, the Lotus Sutra, even though that your Uyghur copy might be a translation of a Chinese version, nevertheless, there are also versions in other languages, including Sanskrit. And those could have been informing the translation. But in the case of Chinese apocryphal scriptures, this is not possible. So this is specifically Chinese texts produced in China. So one of the famous examples is the 佛说天地八阳神咒经. So the divine spell sutra of heaven and earth and the 8 yang as told by the Buddha. So this is, if you work on Old Uyghur, you're probably very familiar with this text because it survives in many, many different editions. This is the Sekiz Yukmak Yaruk. And it's quite interesting, actually, how popular this text was. First of all, it was very popular in Dunhuang, so we have quite a few Chinese versions there. But then also in, just a second. Yeah, and it was also very popular in Uyghur, so in other languages, at least in Uyghur, but possibly also in Tangut. And supposedly this was a scripture that was created specifically in China during the reign of Empress Wu, as you can see here, who reigned at the beginning of the 8th century. So this was not a very old scripture by this time. And finally, I also wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of translation. So like the Sekiz Yukmak Yaruk was a translation from Chinese, but so is this text, which is known or called the story of Shunzi, which I was happy to discover together with my friend and colleague, Kitsudo Koichi. And basically, these are 3 fragments of a Chinese Buddhist text. And the text is the Da Fang Guang Bao Qie Jing, so the Ratnakarandaka Vyuha Sutra. So these 3 fragments originally belonged together. And even though today they're very different in color, nevertheless, they originally were part of the same manuscript. And based on the Chinese text, we can piece them together in this manner. So this is relatively easy because we know the Chinese text is part of the Chinese Buddhist canon. And so we can just kind of use the modern text to put the manuscript together. So to establish the location of the individual pieces. Now, on the other side, however, once we put these fragments together in a certain way, then we can see that there is this other text which is written in Old Uyghur, and this is the text that contains the story of Shunzi. And what happened basically is that when I visited Japan and Kitsudo Koichi, he asked me, he said, well, the text says Shunzi, and then you have the zi here. And what could it be? And at that moment, well, at that time, I was working on these filial piety stories in Chinese, and I immediately thought, just because that's what I was interested in at the time, I immediately thought this would be the story of Shunzi. And then so we gave it a try, and it turned out to be true. So this was that story. And here's another text here. Well, in other Chinese, 2 Chinese characters. And even though it's hard to see what it is, it could be Shunzi. But there's a difference between these 2 sets of Chinese characters, because in this case, this is an addition added by someone after the Uyghur text had been written, whereas in the first case, this seems to be part of the text, even though the Uyghur text replicates it. So it writes the phonetic reading of these 2 characters. And I don't know how familiar you are with this text, but this is usually the first story in the biographies of filial sons. And it is about the sage emperor Shun, one of the mythical emperors in Chinese culture, who is whose father is blind, and then when his mother dies, then his father remarries again, and then his new mother, his stepmother, is always trying to kill him, but he's always very kind and caring about them. And so they try to, the stepmother and his father, they try to put him into a well and then bury the well, but then he somehow gets out and then leaves. And eventually, after many years, he comes back when there's a drought and there's famine in the land. And after selling, basically giving away grain to his parents, eventually his father recognizes him through his voice. And this is the part we can read here. So basically he says, manner of speech, and then the blind man distinctly recognized, this young man is definitely my son, Shunzi, and so forth. So basically, this is the climax of the story, almost like the punchline where everything comes together. And this is the part that appears in the Uyghur text. And this is actually quite spectacular, I think, because I don't think there are other versions of these filial stories of filial sons in Old Uyghur. So this is the only one. But this one copy already tells us that these stories would have been probably also translated into Old Uyghur. So even though this is one story, it kind of allows us to speculate that maybe there were many others as well. And also the Chinese versions, there are several Chinese versions of the story, and one of them is something called a bianwen, so a transformation text, which is kind of it's not just the story itself, but it has a little bit of a Buddhist spin. So, for example, there is the involvement of some deities like Indra and others, and it's quite possible that the Uyghur story is also one of these. So it's a Buddhicized story of Shunzi, because otherwise the Shunzi story is essentially one of these Confucian stories, these filial sons, and the tales about them are essentially Confucian saints. So they are the stories that, according to the Confucian worldview, people would emulate or maybe strive to emulate. But it's quite possible that the Uyghur version is closer to the Buddhist version of the story, to this transformation text or bianwen. Okay, and finally, I wanted to mention yet another interesting article Professor Tima wrote, and I saw that he was in the audience, so I have to admit that what he writes is usually my entrance into Turkology, and it's always very inspiring. So he has this article on Chinese classical literature in Uyghur, and I thought it was extremely interesting. And one of the most interesting things in it is this manuscript, which has a story that is not identified yet. So he talks about a Chinese person potentially called Zhong Guanzi or Guazi, and it doesn't seem to be a Buddhist story, but I don't think we know for sure what kind of text it is, but it's really fascinating. So there are actually there are these translations that we have, but we have not been able to identify what they are. And it would be fascinating if we discovered what this text was. So I'm very much looking forward to somebody kind of recognizing what this story is. And then we would have yet another important Chinese text, or we would have identified yet another important Chinese text. Okay. And I think that's how much I wanted to talk about today. And I thank you all for your patience, and I'm ready to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.